In the misty valleys of ancient Greece, where Mount Olympus pierced the heavens and gods were said to walk among mortals, there existed a sacred tradition that would transcend millennia and unite the entire world in peaceful competition. Long before stadiums held millions of spectators, before television cameras captured every thrilling moment, before gold medals hung around the necks of champions, there was a small valley in western Greece called Olympia, where something extraordinary began that would change human civilization forever. This is not just a story about sports or games or athletic contests, but rather a journey into the very soul of what it means to be human, to strive for excellence, to honor the divine, and to find unity in a world too often torn apart by conflict and war. The Olympic Games did not spring into existence fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus, but emerged slowly over centuries from the religious rituals, political necessities, and human dreams of the ancient Greek people who believed that physical perfection was a form of worship and that athletic competition could bring them closer to the gods themselves. Tonight, as you settle into the gentle embrace of sleep, let us travel back more than 2,700 years to discover how a simple foot race held in honor of Zeus became the most celebrated sporting event in human history, how naked athletes running across a dusty plain became the foundation of an ideal that still inspires billions of people today, and how the ancient Greeks created something so powerful and meaningful that even after centuries of abandonment and forgotten history, it would rise again to capture the imagination of the modern world. Chapter 1. The land of the gods. The story of the Olympic Games cannot be told without first understanding the land where they were born, a rugged peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean Sea, covered with mountains that touched the sky and valleys that held the secrets of the gods. Ancient Greece was not a unified nation as we might imagine today, but rather a collection of independent city-states, each with its own government, its own army, its own customs and traditions, and often its own patron deity who watched over the people and protected them from harm. These city-states, known as polis, included famous names like Athens, the center of learning and philosophy, Sparta, the home of warriors who knew no fear, Corinth, the wealthy trading hub, and Thebes, the ancient stronghold that had stood for countless generations. The Greeks who lived in these cities shared a common language, though spoken in different dialects, a common religion with the same pantheon of gods and goddesses, and a common belief that they were different from all other peoples of the world, whom they called barbaroi or barbarians, those who could not speak proper Greek and who lived outside the light of Hellenic civilization. The landscape itself seemed designed by the gods to create a people of strength and endurance, for the mountains made travel difficult and encouraged each community to develop independently, while the sea provided opportunities for trade, fishing, and communication with distant lands. Between the towering peaks and the azure waters lay fertile valleys where olive trees grew in abundance, providing oil for cooking, lighting, and religious ceremonies, and where grapevines climbed the hillsides, producing wine that would lubricate social gatherings and religious festivals. The climate was Mediterranean, with hot, dry summers that baked the earth until it cracked and mild, wet winters when the rains came to replenish the land and fill the streams that flowed down from the mountains. This was a land where nature itself taught the people to be hardy and resourceful, where survival required physical strength and mental toughness, and where the line between the mortal world and the divine realm seemed thin enough to cross if one knew the right prayers and performed the proper rituals. Chapter 2. The religion of ancient Greece. To understand why the Olympic Games came into existence, one must first understand the religious beliefs that permeated every aspect of ancient Greek life, For these were a people who saw the hand of the gods in everything from the rising of the sun to the outcome of battles to the success or failure of the harvest. The Greeks worshipped a pantheon of deities who lived atop Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in all of Greece, shrouded in clouds and mystery, where mortals could not go but where the immortals feasted on nectar and ambrosia and decided the fates of humans below. At the head of this divine family sat Zeus, the king of the gods, wielder of the thunderbolt, lord of the sky and weather, whose will was supreme and whose anger was terrible to behold. His wife Hera was the queen of the gods and the goddess of marriage and women, though their relationship was stormy and filled with jealousy and conflict. Poseidon ruled the seas with his mighty trident, causing earthquakes when angered and calming the waters when pleased. Athena was the goddess of wisdom and warfare, patron of Athens and protector of heroes. Apollo drove the chariot of the sun across the sky each day and was also the god of music, poetry, and prophecy. Artemis, his twin sister, was the goddess of the hunt and the moon, protector of wild animals and young women. Aphrodite embodied love and beauty, while Ares represented the brutal, bloody aspects of war. Hephaestus was the divine blacksmith who forged weapons for the gods despite his physical deformity and lameness. Hermes served as the messenger of the gods and the guide of souls to the underworld. Demeter controlled the harvest and the seasons, plunging the world into winter when her daughter Persephone was taken to the underworld. Dionysus brought wine and ecstasy and madness. These gods were not distant, abstract beings, but rather anthropomorphic deities with human emotions, desires, jealousies, and flaws, who interfered constantly in mortal affairs, taking sides in wars, falling in love with humans, punishing those who offended them, and rewarding those who showed proper respect and devotion. The Greeks built magnificent temples to honor these gods, made sacrifices of animals and agricultural products to gain their favor, held festivals and religious ceremonies throughout the year, and believed that the gods actively participated in their world, sometimes in disguised forms, walking among humans and testing their virtue and hospitality. Chapter 3: Olympia before the Games. Long before the first Olympic Games were held, the site of Olympia was already sacred ground, a place where religious worship had been conducted for countless generations, though the exact origins are lost in the mists of prehistory and legend. Archaeological evidence suggests that the area was inhabited as early as the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and that by the 2nd millennium, some form of religious activity was taking place there, though we cannot know with certainty what gods were worshipped or what rituals were performed. The location itself was carefully chosen, nestled in the Alpheus River Valley in the western part of the Peloponnese, the large peninsula that forms the southern part of mainland Greece, where the landscape created a natural amphitheater surrounded by gently sloping hills that would eventually hold thousands of spectators. 2 rivers met near this spot, the Alpheus and the Cladios, and the Greeks believed that rivers were sacred and often associated with local deities and nymphs, making this confluence of waters a particularly holy place. The name Olympia derived from Mount Olympus, though the actual mountain where the gods were said to dwell was far to the north, and scholars debate whether the sanctuary was named after the mountain or whether both shared a name that meant something like the heavenly place in the pre-Greek language spoken by the earliest inhabitants of the region. By the time of the historical period, Olympia had definitely become associated with the worship of Zeus, and at the heart of the sanctuary stood an altar dedicated to the king of the gods, where burnt offerings were made regularly, the smoke rising to the heavens to please the immortals above. The area around this altar gradually accumulated other religious structures, including smaller altars to other gods and goddesses, treasuries built by various city-states to house their offerings and display their wealth and piety, and eventually the great temple of Zeus that would become one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. Priests maintained the sacred precinct, performing daily rituals, accepting offerings from pilgrims who came from all over the Greek world, interpreting omens and prophecies, and ensuring that everything was done according to the ancient traditions that had been passed down through the generations. Chapter 4. The myths and legends of origin. The ancient Greeks themselves did not agree on how the Olympic Games began, for they had multiple myths and legends that attempted to explain the origin of this sacred athletic festival, and different cities claimed credit for establishing the tradition, each story reflecting the political interests and religious beliefs of the tellers. One of the most popular myths attributed the founding of the games to the legendary hero Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene, who was renowned throughout the Greek world for his incredible strength and his completion of 12 impossible labors. According to this version, Heracles came to Olympia after completing one of his labors, perhaps the cleaning of the Augean stables, which were located not far from the sanctuary, and in gratitude to his father Zeus, he organized athletic contests in the god's honor, pacing out the length of the stadium himself, which was said to be 600 feet, the distance he could walk while holding his breath. Another myth connected the games to King Oenomaus of Pisa, a city near Olympia, who had a beautiful daughter named Hippodamia and had been warned by an oracle that he would be killed by his son-in-law. So he challenged all suitors to a chariot race, promising Hippodamia's hand to the winner but executing those who lost, which he ensured by having divine horses given to him by his father, the god Ares. The hero Pelops, son of Tantalus, arrived from Asia Minor seeking the king's daughter, and with the help of the king's charioteer, whom he bribed or seduced depending on the version, he defeated Oenomaus, won Hippodamia, and established funeral games in honor of the dead king, which became the Olympic Games. Yet another legend claimed that Zeus himself founded the games after defeating his father Kronos in a great cosmic battle for control of the universe, and the athletic contests celebrated this divine victory. Some traditions spoke of the games being established by Pelops himself as thanksgiving for his victory, while others said his descendants organized them, and still others attributed them to heroes of the Trojan War who stopped at Olympia on their way home and held contests there. The Hellenes, the people who lived in the region around Olympia and who eventually controlled the sanctuary, had their own origin story involving local kings and heroes, naturally emphasizing their own importance in the founding of the games. Chapter 5. The historical beginning. While myths and legends swirled around the origins of the Olympics, historians and archaeologists have worked to determine when the historical games actually began, and the ancient Greeks themselves dated the first Olympiad to the year 776 before the Common Era, making this one of the earliest precisely dated events in ancient Greek history. The first recorded Olympic victor was a man named Charybdis, a cook from the nearby city of Elis, who won the Stadion race, a sprint of approximately 192 meters, roughly the length of the stadium at Olympia, which became the standard distance for this event. This date of 776 may or may not represent the actual first time athletic contests were held at Olympia, for it is possible that informal competitions had taken place earlier, but this year marked the beginning of the systematic record-keeping that the Greeks maintained throughout the history of the ancient Olympics, with each 4-year period being called an Olympiad and used as a chronological reference point in the same way we use our calendar system today. The decision to begin keeping records at this particular time suggests that something significant changed around 776. Perhaps the contests became more organized and regular. Perhaps they attracted participants from multiple cities rather than just being a local festival. Or perhaps the sanctuary at Olympia gained increased importance as a Panhellenic religious center that all Greeks recognized as neutral and sacred ground. Archaeological evidence from Olympia shows an increase in construction activity and the deposition of offerings around this period, supporting the idea that the late 8th century before the Common Era saw a transformation of the site from a local sanctuary into a place of international significance. The early games were probably quite simple compared to what they would become, consisting perhaps of just the single foot race, with no elaborate facilities, no stone stadium, no permanent seating, just athletes running across the dusty ground while spectators sat or stood on the hillsides to watch. But even in this primitive form, the contests clearly resonated with the Greek people, for they continued to be held every 4 years without interruption for over 1,000 years. Through wars and political upheavals, through changes in government and society, remaining constant when so much else changed. Chapter 6. The sacred truce. One of the most remarkable and significant aspects of the ancient Olympic Games was the establishment of the Olympic truce, known in Greek as ekkyria, which was a sacred suspension of hostilities that protected athletes, spectators, and officials traveling to and from Olympia, and which represented one of humanity's earliest attempts to use shared cultural values to transcend political divisions and prevent warfare. The Greeks were not a unified people living in peace, but rather a collection of independent and often hostile city-states that fought frequent wars with each other over territory, resources, trade routes, political ideology, and sometimes seemingly for no reason other than long-standing grudges and wounded pride. In such an environment, holding an international athletic festival presented obvious difficulties. For how could athletes and spectators travel safely through territories controlled by their city's enemies? And how could the sanctuary of Olympia remain neutral and sacred if armies were marching through the region? The solution was the Olympic truce, which was announced by heralds called spondophoroi who traveled throughout the Greek world proclaiming the beginning of the sacred period, which lasted for 3 months, centered on the time of the games themselves. During this truce, all warfare was supposed to cease, though in practice this meant that active military operations were suspended rather than that peace broke out miraculously across the entire Greek world, and the truce primarily guaranteed safe passage for those traveling to and from the festival. The penalty for violating the truce was severe, including heavy fines and exclusion from the games, and the fact that the truce was generally respected, with only a handful of recorded violations over the centuries, demonstrates how seriously the Greeks took their religious obligations and how much they valued the Olympic festival. The truce also meant that the sanctuary of Olympia itself was inviolable, a demilitarized zone where no armies could enter, no weapons could be carried, and no acts of violence could occur, making it a rare island of peace in a world too often dominated by war. This principle of the Olympic truce would inspire modern revival of the Games and continues to be invoked today, though with varying degrees of success, as a symbol of sports potential to promote peace and international understanding. Chapter 7. The events of the ancient Olympics. The athletic program of the ancient Olympics began with a single event, the Stadion race, but over the centuries expanded to include numerous competitions that tested different aspects of physical prowess. And by the time the Games reached their full development, they lasted 5 days and featured a diverse array of contests that showcased the athletic abilities the Greeks most valued. The Stadion remained the premier event throughout ancient Olympic history, and the winner of this race had the entire Olympiad named after him, a form of immortality that Greeks craved more than almost anything, for their names would be recorded in the victor lists and remembered by future generations. As the games evolved, a longer race called the dialos was added, which covered 2 lengths of the stadium, requiring athletes to run down and back. And then came the dalikos, a long-distance race of 20 or 24 lengths, demanding endurance as well as speed. The pentathlon was introduced as a combined event testing 5 different skills: running, jumping, discus throwing, javelin throwing, and wrestling, with the idea that the pentathlete represented the ideal balanced athlete who excelled in multiple disciplines rather than specializing in just one. Wrestling became a standalone event as well, with competitors grappling in a sandy pit until one man was thrown to the ground and pinned or submitted. Boxing was added, though ancient Greek boxing was far more brutal than the modern sport, with fighters wrapping their hands in leather thongs that could cause severe damage, and matches continuing until one fighter was knocked unconscious or raised his hand in submission, with no rounds, no rest periods, and no weight classes to protect smaller men from larger opponents. The Pancration combined wrestling and boxing into a savage contest where almost anything was permitted except biting and eye gouging. Though even these rules were sometimes ignored in the heat of competition, and fighters could kick, punch, strangle, and break limbs, making it perhaps the closest ancient equivalent to modern mixed martial arts. Equestrian events were eventually added, though these were controversial because they allowed the wealthy to compete through their horses rather than their own physical abilities, with chariot racing and horse racing becoming prestigious contests where victory brought glory to the owner of the animals rather than to the jockey or charioteer who actually competed. Chapter 8. The athletes and their training. The athletes who competed in the ancient Olympics were not casual participants, but serious competitors who dedicated years of their lives to training, following strict regimens designed to develop their bodies to peak physical condition. For the Greeks believed that athletic excellence was a form of arete or virtue, and that achieving it required discipline, sacrifice, and devotion. Training typically began in childhood or adolescence when promising young athletes were identified by their families or by professional trainers who recognized potential, and the boys would be sent to a gymnasium, which was not merely a place for exercise but a social and educational institution where physical training was combined with instruction in music, poetry, and philosophy, for the Greeks believed in educating the whole person, body and mind together. The training was supervised by coaches called paedotribi who were expert athletes themselves and who knew the techniques and methods required to develop champions, and these coaches designed individual programs tailored to each athlete's event and physical characteristics, understanding that a runner needed different training than a wrestler, and a boxer required different preparation than a jumper. Athletes trained almost every day, spending hours working on technique, building strength and endurance, practicing their specific skills until every movement became automatic and perfect. They followed special diets designed to build muscle and maintain ideal weight, often consuming large quantities of meat, which was unusual in ancient Greece where most people ate primarily grains, vegetables, and fish, with meat being a luxury reserved for festivals and sacrifices. The exact dietary regimens varied and were subjects of debate among trainers, with some advocating for specific foods thought to enhance different qualities, such as dried figs for wrestlers or fresh cheese for runners, and athletes sometimes ate truly enormous amounts of food to fuel their training, with stories of legendary competitors consuming entire pigs or dozens of loaves of bread in a single sitting. Physical conditioning included running, jumping, lifting weights, and practicing their events, but also less obvious exercises like using leather balls for hand-eye coordination or doing calisthenics to maintain flexibility and balance. Chapter 9. The journey to Olympia. Traveling to Olympia to compete in or witness the Olympic Games was no simple matter in ancient Greece, for the distances were considerable, the roads were poor, and the journey could take weeks or even months depending on one's starting point. Yet thousands of people made this pilgrimage every 4 years, drawn by religious devotion, love of athletics, or simply curiosity and the desire to be part of something greater than themselves. Athletes had to arrive at Olympia at least 30 days before the Games began for a mandatory training period under the supervision of the Olympic judges called Hellenici, who would assess the competitors' readiness and ensure they met the eligibility requirements. And during this month of preparation, the athletes lived in the gymnasium complex and trained together, probably spending some time sizing up their opponents and trying to intimidate their rivals with displays of their abilities. Spectators came from every corner of the Greek world, from the colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, from the cities of Asia Minor across the Aegean Sea, from the islands scattered throughout the Mediterranean, from northern Greece and the lands beyond, all converging on the small valley in the western Peloponnese, creating a temporary city of tents and makeshift shelters that surrounded the sacred precinct. The only major group excluded from attending were married women, who were forbidden from entering Olympia during the Games under penalty of death, though the reason for this prohibition is debated by scholars, with some suggesting it related to ancient religious taboos and others proposing it was connected to the fact that athletes competed nude and the Greeks felt this was inappropriate for married women to witness, while unmarried girls and priestesses of certain goddesses were apparently permitted to attend. The journey itself was facilitated by the Olympic truce, which guaranteed safe passage through territories that might otherwise be dangerous, and travelers often banded together in groups for additional security and companionship, sharing the costs of the journey and helping each other along the difficult roads. Some wealthy spectators traveled in style with slaves to carry their belongings and set up comfortable camps, while others walked the entire distance carrying whatever supplies they could manage, sleeping under the stars or in crude shelters, but all were united in their destination and their purpose. Chapter 10. The religious ceremonies, the Olympic Games, were not merely athletic contests but fundamentally religious ceremonies, and the athletic competitions were only one part of a larger festival honoring Zeus with elaborate rituals and sacrifices that were at least as important as the sports themselves. For the Greeks understood the Olympics as a form of worship, a way of pleasing the gods through displays of human excellence and through the proper performance of ancient traditions. The festival began with religious processions and prayers, with the athletes, judges, trainers, and officials walking together to various altars and temples throughout the sanctuary, making offerings and seeking divine favor for the coming competitions. The most important sacrifice occurred at the great altar of Zeus, which was not inside the temple but stood outdoors, and over the centuries, the altar had grown into an enormous mound from the accumulated ashes and bones of countless animal sacrifices, rising 22 feet high and requiring steps to reach the top where the priests performed the ritual slaughter. On the third day of the festival, a hecatomb was offered, meaning 100 oxen were sacrificed to Zeus, though the actual number probably varied, and the animals were led in procession to the altar, their horns gilded with gold leaf, their bodies washed and purified, while priests chanted prayers and attendants played music. The oxen were stunned with an axe blow to the head, their throats cut so the blood could flow onto the altar, and then they were butchered, with the thigh bones and fat burned as offerings to the gods while the meat was cooked and distributed to the participants as a sacred feast. For sharing in sacrificial meat created a bond between the worshippers and the deity being honored. Other rituals included libations of wine poured onto the ground, hymns sung by choirs, dances performed by young people, and processions of sacred objects, all designed to maintain the proper relationship between humans and gods, to thank Zeus for past blessings, and to seek his continued protection and favor. Chapter 11. The stadium and facilities, the physical setting of the ancient Olympics evolved dramatically over the centuries, beginning with the most basic arrangements and gradually developing into an impressive complex of buildings and monuments that reflected both the increasing importance of the games and the architectural achievements of Greek civilization. The earliest competitions probably took place in an open field with spectators sitting or standing on natural slopes, but by the classical period, Olympia had developed into a carefully designed sanctuary with specific areas designated for different purposes. The stadium itself was a long, narrow embankment with sloping sides where spectators could sit directly on the ground or on temporary wooden benches, and though it never had the permanent stone seating of later Roman amphitheaters, it could accommodate perhaps 40,000 people crowded onto the slopes. The track was approximately one state in length, roughly 192 meters, with the exact distance supposedly determined by Heracles pacing it out, and the surface was simply the natural earth, compacted and smoothed but otherwise unimproved, though the Olympic officials paid careful attention to maintaining it in good condition. Starting and finishing lines were marked with stone slabs that have been discovered by archaeologists, showing grooves where runners placed their toes, giving them better purchase for their starting stance. The hippodrome for equestrian events was separate from the stadium and much larger, needing to accommodate chariot races that required significant space for the vehicles to maneuver and turn, though the exact location of the ancient hippodrome has never been definitely identified, probably because it was located in an area where the Alpheus River has since changed course and washed away all traces. The gymnasium complex where athletes trained included a large courtyard surrounded by colonnades for exercise regardless of weather, with separate rooms for different activities, and adjacent to this was the palestra, a square building with a central court for wrestling and other combat sports, with rooms around the perimeter for washing, massage, and storage of equipment. The athletes also had access to baths, though these were not the elaborate Roman thermae but simpler facilities where they could wash off the oil and dust that accumulated on their bodies during training. Chapter 12. The judges and officials. The smooth operation of the Olympic Games required a significant administrative apparatus headed by the Hellenodici, who were the judges responsible for overseeing all aspects of the festival, and these men wielded enormous power, with their decisions being final and their authority deriving from their role as representatives of Zeus himself, making them sacred officials whose judgments could not be questioned or appealed. The number of Hellenodici varied at different periods of Olympic history, sometimes as few as 1 or 2, sometimes as many as 10, and they were selected from among the citizens of Elis, the city-state that controlled the sanctuary of Olympia and that had the hereditary right to organize the games. The judges trained for their role just as seriously as the athletes trained for theirs, spending 10 months before each Olympiad learning the rules and traditions, studying the proper procedures, and ensuring they understood every aspect of their duties, for errors or corruption on their part would be an offense against Zeus and could bring divine wrath upon the entire Greek world. Their responsibilities began with the preliminary training period when they evaluated athletes to determine if they were properly prepared to compete, and they had the power to exclude any competitor they deemed unworthy, ensuring that only serious, properly trained athletes participated. During the games themselves, the Hellenodici observed all the competitions, watching for violations of the rules, false starts, illegal techniques, or unsportsmanlike conduct, and they carried forked rods that they would use to beat athletes who broke the rules, maintaining discipline through both their sacred authority and the threat of physical punishment. They also determined the winners of each event, which was straightforward in races where the first across the finish line was obvious but more subjective in combat sports where they had to judge when a wrestler or boxer had been defeated, and in the pentathlon where they had to evaluate performance across multiple disciplines to determine the overall victor. Beyond their role as referees, the Hellenodikai also organized the religious ceremonies, oversaw the sacrifices, managed the crowds, resolved disputes, and generally ensured that the festival proceeded according to the ancient traditions. And their job was made more difficult by the fact that they had to deal with proud athletes from rival cities who sometimes brought their political conflicts into the athletic arena, requiring the judges to navigate complex diplomatic situations while maintaining the neutrality and sanctity of the games. Chapter 13. The competition itself. When the day of competition arrived, the atmosphere at Olympia was electric with tension and excitement as athletes prepared to display their abilities before thousands of spectators. Knowing that victory would bring them fame that would last for generations, while defeat meant public humiliation, and the knowledge that they had fallen short of the excellence they had worked so hard to achieve. The athletes competed completely naked, their bodies oiled and gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. And this nudity was not considered shameful but rather honorable. For the Greeks believed that the human body was beautiful and that athletic competitions celebrated the perfection of human physical form, though the custom probably also had practical origins in ensuring no competitor had hidden advantages from clothing or padding. Before entering the competition area, athletes made final prayers and offerings to the gods, some to Zeus asking for victory, others to their city's patron deity seeking protection, and all hoping to avoid injury or embarrassment. For ancient sport was dangerous and competitors frequently suffered serious injuries or even death, especially in the combat sports where the rules were minimal and the philosophy was to fight until one man could continue no longer. The foot races began with all competitors standing at the starting line, toes in the grooves, bodies tensed and ready, until the judge gave the signal and they exploded forward in a sprint that lasted only seconds for the shortest race but required sustained speed and endurance for the longer distances. The stadium echoed with the roar of the crowd, spectators shouting encouragement to their favorites, cheering wildly when their city's athlete took the lead, groaning when he faltered. And this sound must have been overwhelming, thousands of voices rising and falling with the drama of the competition, creating an atmosphere that was both thrilling and intimidating for the athletes. Combat sports brought their own drama, with wrestlers grappling in the sandy pit, their muscles straining as each tried to throw the other to the ground, their bodies becoming covered in dust and sweat that turned to mud, while the crowd watched in tense silence broken by gasps when one fighter executed a particularly skillful throw or by cries of concern when someone was injured. Boxing matches were brutal affairs with blood flowing freely as leather-wrapped fists smashed into faces and bodies. And the pancration was even worse, with fighters using every technique imaginable to hurt their opponents. The sand of the pit often stained red by the end of a particularly savage contest. Chapter 14. The victor's crown victory at the Olympic Games brought rewards that were both immediate and lasting, though interestingly, the ancient Olympics did not award the elaborate prizes we associate with modern sport, for the actual prize given to the winner was remarkably simple, yet it carried a meaning and significance far beyond its material value. The Olympic victor received a crown woven from the branches of a wild olive tree that grew in the sacred grove near the temple of Zeus, a tree that, according to legend, had been planted by Heracles himself, and this crown, known as a kotinos, was the only official prize given at Olympia, in sharp contrast to other Greek athletic festivals where victors might receive valuable prizes like bronze tripods, amphoras filled with expensive olive oil, or even money. The simplicity of the olive crown reflected the ideal that Olympic competition was about glory and honor rather than material gain, that athletes competed to prove their excellence and to win eternal fame rather than to enrich themselves. though in reality, victorious athletes received substantial rewards when they returned home to their cities. The moment of victory and crowning was one of intense emotion, with the new champion being lifted on the shoulders of his supporters, carried in triumph around the stadium while the crowd roared its approval, and then brought before the Hellenodikai, who placed the olive crown on his head while proclaiming his name, his father's name, and his city, information that would be recorded in the victor lists that the Olympic officials carefully maintained. The herald would then announce the victory throughout the sanctuary, ensuring that everyone present knew who had triumphed, and the victor's name might also be inscribed on monuments or dedications that his city erected at Olympia, permanently recording his achievement. For the athlete, this moment represented the culmination of years of training and sacrifice, the fulfillment of dreams that had sustained him through countless hours of painful preparation, and the winning of a form of immortality. For Olympic victors were remembered long after their deaths, their victories recounted in songs and poems, their names known to future generations as exemplars of human excellence. The religious significance of the crown should not be underestimated, for it was not just a trophy but a sacred object that had been cut from a holy tree and blessed by the priests of Zeus, making the victor someone who had been singled out by the gods for special honor, someone who had achieved a level of physical excellence that brought him closer to the divine. Chapter 15. Life after victory. Winning an Olympic crown transformed an athlete's life in ways both wonderful and challenging. For Olympic victors returned to their home cities as heroes, receiving honors and privileges that set them apart from ordinary citizens, yet also facing pressures and expectations that could be difficult to bear. The journey home was itself a triumphal procession, with the victor often traveling slowly from city to city, accepting congratulations and gifts along the way, his arrival in each place becoming an occasion for celebration and feasting, and by the time he reached his own city, news of his victory had already spread and the entire population would turn out to welcome him. Many cities did not allow their Olympic champions to enter through the normal gates, but instead broke a section of the city wall and led the victor through this special opening, symbolically suggesting that a city with such a man to defend it had no need of walls, for his excellence would protect his homeland better than stone fortifications. The tangible rewards that cities bestowed on Olympic victors were substantial, often including lifetime pensions paid from public funds, free meals in the city's Prytaneum where public officials dined, front row seats at the theater and at other public events, exemption from taxes and military service, and sometimes even cash prizes despite the amateur ideals of the games themselves. The city might also commission a statue of the victor to be erected in the public square or at Olympia itself, and wealthy patrons or the athlete's family might hire a famous poet to compose victory odes celebrating his achievement, with Pindar being the most renowned of these poets, his elaborate and sophisticated verses praising victorious athletes being among the finest examples of ancient Greek literature that have survived to the present day. Some Olympic champions leveraged their fame into political careers, using their prestige to win election to public office or to influence their city's policies. For Greeks were impressed by athletic success and considered it evidence of overall excellence and capability that extended beyond sport. Others continued competing at the various athletic festivals held throughout the Greek world, collecting victories at games in Delphi, Corinth, Nemea, and elsewhere, seeking to become periodonics, which meant winners of the entire circuit of major games, a status that brought even greater glory than a single Olympic victory. Chapter 16. The expansion of the Games. As the Olympic Games grew in prestige and popularity, the athletic program expanded beyond the original single foot race to include the diverse array of events that would characterize the classical period, with each new edition reflecting changing Greek values and the increasing sophistication of athletic training and competition. The expansion was not random but followed a logical progression, with running events of varying distances being added first, then jumping and throwing events that tested different physical capabilities, followed by combat sports that displayed fighting skills, and finally equestrian events that required wealth and resources beyond what most individuals could provide. The Dialos, or double-stayed race, was reportedly added in the 14th Olympiad, or 724 before the Common Era, requiring runners to complete 2 lengths of the stadium rather than 1, testing their ability to maintain speed over a longer distance and adding the complexity of making a tight turn around the post at the far end. The Dolichos appeared in the 15th Olympiad, creating a long-distance race that demanded endurance and strategic pacing, with runners completing anywhere from 7 to 24 lengths of the stadium depending on which ancient source one believes, and the first victor in this event was Acanthus of Sparta, beginning a long tradition of Spartan dominance in endurance events that reflected their military training, which emphasized toughness and stamina. The pentathlon was introduced in the 18th Olympiad 708 before the Common Era, and from the beginning it was considered the most prestigious of all Olympic events, for the pentathlete was seen as the complete athlete who excelled in multiple disciplines rather than specializing in just one, combining speed, strength, precision, and combat skills into a balanced package that represented the Greek ideal of the harmoniously developed individual. Wrestling came to the Olympics as a separate event in the same Olympiad as the pentathlon, followed by boxing in the 23rd Olympiad, and the pancration in the 33rd Olympiad 648 before the Common Era, each combat sport becoming immediately popular with spectators who appreciated the drama and violence of watching men fight for supremacy. The equestrian events were controversial additions, with the 4-horse chariot race being added in the 25th Olympiad and horse racing following later. And while these events attracted enormous interest and prestige, they also marked a departure from the original Olympic ideals because victory went to the owner of the horses rather than to the charioteer or jockey who actually competed, allowing the wealthy to win Olympic crowns without personally demonstrating athletic excellence. Chapter 17. Famous Olympic champions over the centuries of ancient Olympic competition. Certain athletes achieved such extraordinary success that their names became legendary. Their victories celebrated in poetry and remembered in stories passed down through generations, and these champions embodied the Greek ideal of arete, or excellence, demonstrating through their athletic achievements a level of human capability that approached the divine. Leonidas of Rhodes was perhaps the greatest Olympic runner of all time, competing in 4 consecutive Olympiads from 164 to 152 before the Common Era and winning the Stadion, Dialos, and race in armor at each Games, a total of 12 Olympic victories that stood as a record for centuries until it was finally equaled by Michael Phelps in the modern Olympics. Milo of Croton was the most famous wrestler in ancient Greece, winning the Olympic wrestling competition 6 times between 540 and 516 before the Common Era, and stories about his strength became legendary, including tales that he could carry a full-grown bull on his shoulders and that he once held up a collapsing roof with his own body, saving everyone inside the building, and his training methods were said to have involved carrying a newborn calf every day, until it was a full-grown bull, thereby gradually increasing his strength. Diagoras of Rhodes was celebrated not only for his own Olympic boxing victory in 464 before the Common Era, but also for the achievements of his family, as his sons won Olympic victories in boxing and pancration, and his grandsons also won Olympic crowns, making his family the most successful athletic dynasty in Olympic history. Theogenes of Thassos was another legendary athlete, credited with winning 1,400 victories at athletic festivals throughout the Greek world during his career. though this number seems impossibly high and probably includes local competitions as well as major games, and he won Olympic crowns in both boxing and pancration, demonstrating extraordinary fighting ability, and after his death, his fellow citizens erected a statue of him that supposedly possessed healing powers and became an object of cultic worship. Polydamas of Scotussa was renowned for his incredible strength, winning the Olympic pancration in 408 before the Common Era, but becoming more famous for his legendary exploits, which supposedly included killing a lion with his bare hands in imitation of Heracles and stopping a charging chariot by grabbing it and holding it in place, though these stories probably owe more to mythology than to actual events. Chapter 18. Women and the Olympics. The question of women's participation in the ancient Olympic Games is complex and reveals much about Greek attitudes toward gender. For while married women were forbidden from even attending the festival at Olympia, women were not entirely excluded from athletic competition in ancient Greece, and some women achieved recognition as Olympic champions, though in very limited circumstances. The ban on married women attending the Games was strictly enforced, with the penalty supposedly being death by being thrown from Mount Typaeon, though there is only one recorded case of a woman violating this rule and surviving to tell the tale, the story of Calipatira, who disguised herself as a male trainer to watch her son compete. And when he won, she leaped over the barrier in excitement, revealing her identity. But the judges pardoned her because her father, brothers, and son were all Olympic victors, and they changed the rules to require all trainers to appear naked at the Games, just like the athletes, to prevent such deceptions in the future. The reason for excluding married women is debated, with ancient sources offering various explanations, and the most common suggestion is that it was considered inappropriate for married women to see naked male athletes, though this explanation is problematic given that the same restriction did not apply to unmarried girls, and some scholars propose that the exclusion had deeper roots in ancient religious taboos or in the connection between athletic training and military preparation, which was seen as exclusively male domain. However, women could own horses and chariots that competed in the equestrian events, and they were credited with the victory if their team won, making it possible for women to become Olympic champions without actually being present at the Games. And several women did exactly this, most famously Cyniska of Sparta, sister of King Agesilaus, who won the four-horse chariot race twice in 396 and 392 before the Common Era, becoming the first woman to achieve Olympic victory, though her brother may have encouraged her participation partly to demonstrate his contempt for the equestrian events, which he believed required wealth rather than personal excellence. In addition to the possibility of victory in equestrian events, women had their own separate athletic festival at Olympia called the Heraia, held in honor of the goddess Hera, where unmarried girls competed in foot races, wearing tunics that left their right shoulder bare and with their hair hanging loose, running a slightly shorter course than the male stadion, and victors received olive crowns and portions of a cow sacrificed to Hera. Though this festival never achieved the prestige or Panhellenic significance of the men's Olympics. Chapter 19. Cheating and punishment. Despite the sacred nature of the Olympic Games and the ideal that athletes competed purely for glory rather than for material gain, cheating was a persistent problem throughout Olympic history, and the punishments for those caught violating the rules could be severe, both in terms of immediate penalties and in terms of lasting shame that could destroy an athlete's reputation and his city's honor. The most common form of cheating was bribery, with athletes or their supporters attempting to pay opponents to deliberately lose, and numerous cases are recorded in the ancient sources, suggesting that such corruption was not rare despite the organizers' best efforts to prevent it. One famous case occurred in 388 before the Common Era when a boxer named Eupolis of Thessaly bribed 3 opponents to let him win, and when the plot was discovered by the Hellenodici, all 4 men were heavily fined, and the money was used to erect bronze statues of Zeus along the entrance to the stadium, with inscriptions detailing the transgression and warning future athletes against similar misconduct. And these statues, called Danes, served as permanent reminders of the disgrace that awaited cheaters. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, there were 16 of these warning statues lining the path to the stadium, each one representing a case of proven cheating, and athletes had to walk past these monuments of shame every time they entered to compete, a psychological tactic designed to discourage dishonesty. Other forms of cheating included false starts in races, where an athlete might deliberately try to gain an advantage by beginning before the signal, and the Hellenodici would beat such offenders with their rods and sometimes disqualify them from the race entirely. In combat sports, some athletes used illegal techniques such as biting or eye gouging, which were specifically prohibited even in the brutal Pancration, and fighters caught using these methods would be beaten and might be barred from future competition. The punishments extended beyond the individual athletes to their entire cities, for Olympic cheating was seen not just as personal dishonesty but as a betrayal of one's homeland, and cities might be collectively fined or excluded from future games if their athletes were caught cheating, creating peer pressure against dishonesty as athletes knew they would bring disgrace not just on themselves but on everyone they represented. The shame of being exposed as a cheater was considered far worse than the physical punishments or financial penalties, for it meant the permanent loss of honor and the transformation from celebrated hero to despised villain, with the athlete's name becoming synonymous with dishonesty and moral failure rather than excellence and virtue. Chapter 20. The Olympic festival experience. Attending the ancient Olympic Games was about far more than just watching athletic competitions. For the 5-day festival offered a complete cultural experience that included religious ceremonies, artistic performances, intellectual discussions, commercial opportunities, and social networking, making Olympia a temporary center of Greek civilization where people from all backgrounds could interact and exchange ideas in a unique environment. The festival attracted not just athletes and spectators, but also poets, philosophers, historians, and artists who used the gathering as an opportunity to present their work to the largest and most diverse audience available in the ancient Greek world. For where else could one find tens of thousands of people assembled in one place, including the wealthy and powerful decision-makers from every Greek city, along with common citizens and foreign visitors curious about Greek culture? Herodotus supposedly gave public readings of his histories at Olympia, establishing his reputation and ensuring that his work would be widely known, and other writers followed his example, reciting their compositions in the shade of the colonnades or under temporary tents set up for the purpose. Philosophers engaged in debates and gave lectures on ethics, politics, natural science, and metaphysics, attracting crowds of listeners who were eager to hear new ideas and to participate in discussions with some of the greatest minds of the age. And these intellectual activities were seen as complementary to the athletic competitions rather than as contradictions, for the Greeks believed in developing both body and mind, in cultivating physical excellence alongside intellectual achievement. Artists and craftsmen sold their wares, offering everything from sculptures and paintings to pottery and metalwork, and many athletes commissioned victory statues from famous sculptors like Phidias or Polykleitos, creating works of art that celebrated their achievements while displaying the wealth and taste of their families or cities. Food vendors did brisk business feeding the crowds, though the conditions were often uncomfortable, with thousands of people crowded into a relatively small area, inadequate sanitation, scorching heat in the summer sun, dust everywhere, and flies attracted by the animal sacrifices and the food waste leading the philosopher Epictetus to later joke that people put up with terrible conditions at Olympia but would complain if they experienced the same discomfort at home, demonstrating how powerfully the games drew people despite the physical hardships. The evenings brought symposia where men gathered to drink wine, discuss philosophy and politics, recite poetry, and forge alliances. For the Olympic Festival was also a crucial venue for diplomacy and political negotiation, with representatives from various cities meeting informally to discuss treaties, trade agreements, and military alliances, using the neutral and sacred ground of Olympia as a place where enemies could talk without losing face. Chapter 21. The role of city-states. The Olympic Games served not just as an athletic festival and religious celebration, but also as an arena where Greek city-states competed for prestige and demonstrated their power and wealth to rivals and allies alike, making the Games an important element of intercity politics and identity formation. Each city wanted to be represented at Olympia by victorious athletes who would bring glory to their homeland, and successful athletic programs became a source of civic pride comparable to military victories or cultural achievements, with cities investing resources in training facilities, coaching, and supporting promising athletes in hopes that they would win Olympic crowns. Some cities, particularly Sparta and later Croton in southern Italy, developed reputations for athletic excellence based on their numerous Olympic victories. And this athletic success reflected and reinforced broader cultural values. As Spartan dominance in endurance events and combat sports grew from their military training system, which emphasized physical toughness and fighting skills, while Croton's success may have been related to their wealth and healthy climate. Cities erected treasuries at Olympia, small temple-like buildings that housed valuable offerings and served primarily as advertisements of civic wealth and piety, with each city trying to outdo its rivals in the magnificence of its treasury and the richness of its dedications, creating a kind of architectural competition that paralleled the athletic contests. The treasuries lined the northern edge of the sanctuary in a row called the Treasury Terrace, where visitors could see the accumulated offerings of generations and compare the relative generosity and wealth of different cities. And archaeologists have excavated the remains of these buildings, finding evidence of elaborate decoration and expensive materials that demonstrate how seriously cities took their representation at Olympia. When an athlete won an Olympic crown, it was seen as a victory for his entire city, not just a personal achievement, and the city would celebrate accordingly, sometimes declaring public holidays, holding festivals, making sacrifices to the gods in thanksgiving, and honoring the athlete with rewards and privileges that recognized his contribution to civic prestige. Conversely, when a city's athletes failed to win, or worse yet, were caught cheating, the shame fell not just on the individual but on the entire community, damaging the city's reputation and providing ammunition for rivals to use in disputes and propaganda. This connection between athletic success and civic identity meant that the Olympics became entangled with the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and conflicts that characterized Greek interstate relations. And while the Olympic truce prevented open warfare during the festival, it could not completely remove politics from the Games, as cities used their Olympic success or failures as arguments in debates over leadership and influence in the Greek world. Chapter 22. The decline begins. The ancient Olympic Games survived for over 1,000 years, persisting through enormous changes in the Greek world, but eventually they entered a period of decline that would lead to their ultimate cessation, and the causes of this decline were complex, involving military conquest, religious change, political transformation, and shifting cultural values. The rise of Macedon under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great in the 4th century, before the Common Era, fundamentally altered the Greek political landscape. transforming the world of independent city-states into one dominated by monarchical kingdoms. And while the Olympics continued under Macedonian and later Roman rule, they gradually lost some of their original significance as an expression of city-state competition and identity. The Roman conquest of Greece, completed in 146 before the Common Era, brought stability and peace to the region but also subordinated Greek culture to Roman power. And while the Romans generally respected Greek traditions and continued to allow the Olympics to operate, they also introduced changes that diluted the Hellenic character of the Games, including allowing Roman citizens to compete and treating the festival more as entertainment than as sacred religious ceremony. The Romans were fascinated by Greek athletics and often attended the Olympics as spectators, but they also had their own sporting traditions, particularly gladiatorial combat and chariot racing in circuses, which Romans generally found more exciting than Greek athletics, and over time, Roman tastes began to influence the Games, with increasing emphasis on spectacle and decreasing attention to the religious and educational aspects that had been central to the original Olympic ideal. The rise of Christianity posed an even greater threat to the Olympics, for the new religion was hostile to paganism and opposed to athletic nudity. And as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and eventually became the official state religion, there was increasing pressure to shut down festivals like the Olympics that were explicitly pagan in nature and that celebrated gods like Zeus, whom Christians considered false idols or demons. The Olympic sanctuary at Olympia had accumulated enormous wealth over the centuries from dedications, offerings, and treasuries, and this attracted thieves and looters, particularly during periods of political instability, and several Roman emperors actually plundered Olympia, removing famous statues and artworks to decorate their palaces or to sell for cash, gradually stripping the sanctuary of the treasures that had made it one of the wonders of the ancient world. Chapter 23. The Final Games. The exact date when the ancient Olympic Games were held for the last time is uncertain and has been debated by historians for centuries, with the traditional answer being 393 or 394 of the Common Era, though this date is based on later Christian sources that may not be entirely reliable and that had theological reasons for wanting to emphasize the suppression of pagan practices. What we know with more certainty is that the Olympics continued to be held well into the Christian era, even after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, suggesting that the Games were too important and too deeply rooted in culture to be eliminated immediately, and that they died a slow death rather than being suddenly abolished. The Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree in 393 banning pagan festivals, and this is often cited as the moment when the Olympics ended, but the decree was general rather than specific to Olympia, and it is unclear how effectively it was enforced, particularly in Greece where pagan traditions remained strong despite official Christianity. Theodosius's son and successor, Theodosius II, issued more decrees against paganism in the early 5th century, and these may have finally ended Olympic competition, though again the historical record is frustratingly vague. What is clear is that by the early 5th century, the Olympics were either already finished or would very soon cease, and the reasons extended beyond just imperial decrees to include the general decline of classical civilization, the economic problems afflicting the Roman Empire, the disruption caused by barbarian invasions, and the transformation of religious and cultural values that made a pagan athletic festival seem increasingly irrelevant or even offensive. The final games, whenever exactly they occurred, were probably a shadow of the festival's former glory, with fewer competitors, smaller crowds, less money for prizes and facilities, and a general sense of exhaustion and decline, as the tradition that had lasted for over a millennium finally wound down to its conclusion. The sanctuary at Olympia was damaged by earthquakes in 522 and 551, and these natural disasters, combined with the neglect that followed the end of the games, gradually reduced the once magnificent complex to ruins, with buildings collapsing, statues toppling, and the famous Temple of Zeus being destroyed, though whether by Christian iconoclasts deliberately targeting pagan monuments or simply by natural decay and stone robbers looking for building materials, we cannot be sure. The Alpheus River changed its course, flooding parts of the site and burying others under layers of silt and sediment, and over the centuries, Olympia was completely forgotten, becoming just another ruined site in a landscape full of abandoned ancient monuments, with local people sometimes aware that something important had once stood there, but no longer remembering what it had been or why it mattered. Chapter 24. Rediscovery and excavation for more than 1,000 years. The sanctuary of Olympia lay hidden beneath layers of earth and rubble, its location known only vaguely from ancient texts that had been preserved in medieval monasteries. And while some travelers and antiquarians visited the site and speculated about what might be buried there, systematic excavation did not begin until the 19th century, when European interest in classical antiquity reached new heights. The French sent an expedition in 1829 that conducted preliminary investigations and removed some sculptures. But the first major excavations were carried out by German archaeologists beginning in 1875. And these excavations, which continued with some interruptions for decades, gradually revealed the remains of the ancient sanctuary and recovered thousands of artifacts that revolutionized understanding of the Olympic Games and of ancient Greek civilization. Generally, the German Archaeological Institute, with the permission and cooperation of the Greek government, carefully excavated the major buildings and monuments, including the Temple of Zeus, the Temple of Hera, the stadium, the gymnasium, the palestra, and the various treasuries and monuments, using techniques that were advanced for their time, though quite crude by modern archaeological standards. They discovered the remains of the great statue of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though the statue itself had been destroyed in antiquity, and only the foundation and some fragments remain to hint at its former magnificence. They found thousands of bronze and stone objects, including tools, weapons, decorative items, and dedications that pilgrims had offered to the gods, providing invaluable information about ancient Greek art, technology, and religious practices. They also recovered inscribed stone slabs that listed Olympic victors, allowing scholars to reconstruct much of the game's history and to correlate Olympic chronology with other ancient calendars, making the Olympics one of the most important reference points for dating events in ancient Greek history. The excavations attracted international attention and sparked renewed interest in the Olympic Games, contributing to the movement that would eventually lead to their revival in the modern era. For people who read about the discoveries at Olympia or who saw the artifacts in museums became fascinated by the idea that such an important sporting tradition had existed in antiquity and began to wonder whether something similar could be recreated for the modern world. Chapter 25. The Legacy. And modern revival. The influence of the ancient Olympic Games extended far beyond their own time and continued to shape Western civilization even during the centuries when the festival itself was long defunct and half forgotten. For the ideal of peaceful athletic competition between different nations, the notion that sports could serve higher purposes than mere entertainment, and the belief that physical excellence represented a form of virtue all had their roots in the ancient Olympics and would eventually inspire the modern revival of the Games. Various attempts to revive Olympic-style competition occurred before the successful modern Olympics, including the much Wenlock Olympian Games in England beginning in 1850 and the Zappas Olympics in Greece starting in 1859, But these were local or national affairs that did not capture international imagination, and it was Pierre de Coubertin, a French educator and historian, who successfully created a truly international Olympic movement that would bring the Games back to life on a global scale. Coubertin believed that physical education and sports were essential for developing well-rounded individuals and that international athletic competition could promote understanding and peace between nations. Ideas that resonated with the ancient Greek Olympic ideals, even if Coubertin's vision was adapted to modern circumstances and values. He organized a conference in Paris in 1894 where representatives from 9 countries agreed to revive the Olympic Games as an international festival, and they decided to hold the first modern Olympics in Athens in 1896, a choice that honored the Greek origins of the tradition and that created a symbolic link between the ancient and modern games. Those first modern Olympics were modest compared to what the Games would become, with only 14 nations participating and fewer than 250 athletes competing in 9 sports, but they were successful enough to establish the Olympics as an ongoing event, and the Games continued to be held every 4 years, growing larger and more elaborate with each Olympiad. The modern Olympics retain some elements from ancient times, including the 4-year cycle, the emphasis on individual athletic achievement, the spirit of international competition, and the awarding of olive crowns in the early modern games, though these were later replaced by gold, silver, and bronze medals that had no ancient precedent. However, the modern Olympics also differed from the ancient games in fundamental ways, being open to athletes of all nations rather than just Greeks, including women from the beginning despite initial resistance, featuring winter sports in addition to summer events, embracing amateurism more strictly than the ancients had, and eventually allowing professionalization that the ancient ideal had technically opposed even if the reality had been more complicated. Chapter 26. The Enduring. Meaning the story of the ancient Olympic Games holds significance that extends beyond sports history to touch on fundamental questions about human nature, culture, society, and values, offering lessons and inspiration that remain relevant even after more than 2 millennia have passed since the festival's heyday. The Olympics demonstrated that human beings could create shared traditions and institutions that transcended political divisions and that brought together people who might otherwise be enemies, showing that common cultural values could be more powerful than political disagreements. An insight that has profound implications for our own time when the world remains fragmented by conflicts and mutual distrust. The ancient games embodied the Greek ideal of arete or excellence, the belief that human beings should strive to develop their capabilities to the fullest extent possible, and that the pursuit of excellence was itself a worthy goal regardless of the specific domain in which one competed, whether athletics, art, philosophy, or any other field, and this ideal remains inspirational as a counterweight to mediocrity and complacency. The religious dimension of the ancient Olympics reminds us that sports and physical activity have often been connected to deeper spiritual meanings and purposes, that athletic competition could be understood as a form of worship or as a way of honoring the divine. And while modern Olympics are secular events, there remains something almost religious in the reverence with which we treat great athletes and in the sense of transcendence that sporting achievement can produce. The ancient Olympic truce, even though imperfectly observed, represented humanity's recognition that some things are more important than conflict and that certain times and places should be kept free from violence. An idea that inspired the modern Olympic movement's emphasis on using sport to promote peace and that continues to challenge us to imagine ways that shared human activities might reduce rather than exacerbate international tensions. The dark side of the Olympics, including the cheating, the political manipulation, the inequality between rich and poor competitors, and the eventual decline into corruption and irrelevance, also offers important lessons about the fragility of institutions and ideals, reminding us that even the most noble traditions can be corrupted if people lose sight of their original purposes or if they prioritize winning over the values that competition is meant to serve. The very fact that the ancient Olympics could be lost for over 1,000 years and then revived demonstrates the resilience of powerful ideas and the human capacity to reclaim and reinterpret traditions from the past, adapting them to new circumstances while maintaining continuity with ancient wisdom.